A black boy interrupts a judge during trial. What he says next leaves the entire courtroom in shock. The courtroom felt like a cage, an expensive one, polished and pristine, but still a cage. Marcus Reed sat at the defendant's table, his hands resting in his lap, his wrists unchained but still feeling the weight of invisible shackles. He had been sitting in this same chair for months, listening to the same voices tear apart his life, watching the same faces pretend to weigh justice when their minds had been made up from the start. The air in the room was heavy with the stench of routine injustice. The ceiling lights buzzed, casting a dim glow over the wooden benches where spectators sat, most of them barely paying attention anymore. The energy had drained from the room after so many weeks of hearings, witness testimonies, and legal arguments that felt less like a search for truth and more like a performance. Marcus barely noticed the murmuring voices behind him anymore. He had stopped hoping for compassion from the people who came to watch. They weren't here for him. They were here for the spectacle. A black man on trial was just another show to them. The judge, an older man with deep lines of disinterest carved into his face, shuffled through the papers on his desk. He had heard everything, but his expression never changed, as if Marcus's fate had been sealed before the trial had even begun. Marcus sat still, his body tense, his face unreadable. He wouldn't let them see fear. He wouldn't let them break him. Across the room, the prosecutor stood tall, confident. He had been like this the entire trial, arrogant, certain, almost amused at the idea that Marcus thought he had a chance. He had painted Marcus as a career criminal, a menace to society, a man who had no place among decent people. The jury, all white, all stiff and silent, had barely even looked at Marcus. They didn't see him. They only saw the version of him the prosecutor had created. Marcus was none of the things they called him. He was innocent. But innocence didn't matter when the truth was nothing more than an inconvenience. The case against him had been built on sand, but it hadn't mattered. There had been a robbery, a corner store hit late at night, the cashier held at gunpoint, the suspect leaving with a bag of cash and cigarettes. The security footage was grainy, the figure in the video nothing more than a shadow, but that hadn't stopped the police. Marcus fit the description: black, broad shoulders, a hoodie. That was all it took. The witnesses, all of them white, had sworn they saw him that night. None of them had looked at him twice before the trial, but once his face was placed in front of them, they were certain. Marcus had an alibi, but no one cared to hear it. He hadn't been anywhere near that corner store. But the public defender assigned to him had been overworked, juggling a dozen cases at once. By the time a real lawyer had stepped in to fight for him, the system had already wrapped its noose around his name. For months, he had watched his life be twisted into something unrecognizable. Every day his lawyer fought, but evidence meant nothing when the people in power had already decided the outcome. And now, the time had come. Today, the judge would give his ruling. Marcus could feel the tension in the air, a thick, suffocating weight pressing down on him. The prosecutor had demanded 50 years. 50 years for something he hadn't done. Marcus took a slow breath, feeling his muscles tighten. He wouldn't plead. He wouldn't beg. He had accepted long ago that the system wasn't built for men like him. The judge lifted his gavel slightly, his gaze barely meeting Marcus's eyes. The wooden handle felt like an executioner's axe hanging in the air. Then, it happened. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open with a force that sent a sharp echo ricocheting off the walls. The entire room froze. A sharp, high-pitched voice cut through the suffocating silence, breathless and full of urgency. A boy, a black boy, no older than 12, standing in the doorway, chest rising and falling as if he had run all the way here. His clothes were slightly oversized, his sneakers worn at the toes. His hands trembled not with fear but with desperation. Marcus turned, his stomach clenching at the sight of him. The judge furrowed his brow, clearly irritated by the interruption. The bailiff took a step forward, ready to remove the boy, but something in his wide, frantic eyes made everyone pause. The prosecutor's face twisted with annoyance, his lips already forming the words to demand the boy be thrown out. But before anyone could speak, before the judge could demand silence, before the bailiff could grab the boy's arm, he took a step forward. His small fists clenched at his sides. His face was damp with sweat. But his voice, when it came again, was clear, sharp, and louder than it had any right to be in a room meant for men with power. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The boy wasn't looking at the judge. He wasn't looking at the bailiff. He was looking directly at the prosecutor. His voice shook, but his words did not break. He knew something. And whatever it was about to change everything. The judge's eyes narrowed, his mouth opening to speak, but the boy stepped forward again, his small frame suddenly feeling enormous in the dead silence of the courtroom. The moment stretched, hanging on the edge of something dangerous, something unpredictable. For months, Marcus had felt like he was screaming into an empty void, his voice drowned out by a system that had never intended to hear him. Now this boy had done something no one else had. He had forced them to listen. The air in the courtroom shifted, something unseen but powerful settling into the space between the walls. Marcus had spent the entire trial watching his life be picked apart by men in suits, by strangers who didn't know him and didn't care to. But now, this child, this boy who owed him nothing, had just cracked the foundation of the case with 4 simple words. And no one in that room knew what to do next. The boy's voice trembled, the slightest quiver in his words betraying his fear, but still, he did not waver. His small frame stood in stark contrast to the towering walls of the courtroom, yet in that moment, he commanded the attention of every soul within its confines. Every eye turned toward him, the lawyers with their briefcases of carefully constructed lies, the jury whose faces had remained expressionless throughout the trial, the judge whose gavel had sentenced countless men before, and even Marcus, who sat frozen in his seat, disbelief and hope clashing in his chest. For months, Marcus had endured this courtroom, each day feeling less like a man and more like a phantom, a mere shadow ignored and dismissed. His words had been shredded, his truths buried under the weight of accusations. But now, this boy, this child who had burst into the courtroom with nothing but his voice and the courage in his heart, had made them all stop, had made them listen. The judge leaned forward, his brows knitting together in a mix of irritation and surprise. His fingers drummed against the polished wood of the bench, a subtle yet telling sign of his impatience. He was a man who had ruled over hundreds of cases, his decisions often swift and indifferent, but no one had ever interrupted his courtroom like this. He was ready to dismiss the boy, to restore the order he so fiercely controlled. But before the judge could speak, before his gavel could fall, the boy took another step into the room. His small fists were clenched tightly at his sides, the knuckles white from the force of his grip. His gaze never faltered, not once drifting to Marcus, but instead fixing on the prosecutor, the man who had woven a web of lies with such ease, the man who had twisted facts into weapons meant to cage an innocent soul. Then the boy spoke again, his words cutting through the thick silence like a blade. He didn't shout, but the intensity in his voice resonated throughout the room, carrying the weight of a truth that had been ignored for too long. He accused the prosecutor of lying, directly, fearlessly. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence, the kind that seemed to stretch time itself, forcing everyone to confront the reality of what had just been said. The prosecutor's back stiffened, the smug confidence he had worn like armor slipping away as his face flushed an angry red. The judge's expression darkened, his authority challenged in a way he was not accustomed to. Yet the boy stood his ground, his chest heaving with every breath, but his stance unwavering. His words came quickly, tumbling out in a rush as though he feared that if he paused, even for a moment, he would lose the chance to speak. He declared that he had been present the night of the robbery, that he had seen the true criminal's face, and that it was not Marcus. A ripple of murmurs and gasps spread through the courtroom, the air thick with disbelief and curiosity. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers gripping the edges of his papers as if they might provide him with some measure of control. The judge's gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing as he addressed the boy, his tone a blend of skepticism and caution. He questioned the boy, demanding to know if he truly understood the gravity of his statements. The boy nodded, his head bobbing with a determination that belied his age. His hands still trembled, but his voice held steady, strengthened by the necessity of his words. He confessed his previous silence, admitting that fear had kept him quiet, but that he could no longer bear the thought of an innocent man losing his freedom for another's crime. Marcus, seated just a few feet away, felt his heart thudding violently against his ribs. The world around him blurred, the faces of the jury, the disdain of the prosecutor, even the looming figure of the judge, all of it fading into the background. Only the boy remained in focus, a beacon of hope in a place that had sought to strip him of it. The prosecutor's face contorted with barely restrained rage, his authority unraveling under the boy's words. He opened his mouth, a retort on his tongue, a dismissal ready to discredit this unexpected threat to his case. But the boy wasn't done. He reached into the pocket of his oversized jacket, pulling out a small, battered phone. The corners were chipped, the screen spider-webbed with cracks, but it held something far more powerful than appearances. Without waiting for permission, he unlocked the screen and began playing a video. The faint hum of static filled the room, replaced by muffled voices and the grainy image of the same store the robbery had occurred in. Only this time, the footage was clearer, closer, undeniable. The figure that appeared wasn't Marcus. It was another man, his face sharp and unmistakable, caught in the act of walking out with the stolen goods, the same goods Marcus had been accused of taking. The man wore the exact jacket the prosecutor had claimed was Marcus's, and his face was captured in perfect clarity, a damning contrast to the blurred mess used to convict Marcus. The courtroom erupted into chaos, voices rising, accusations flying, the balance of power shifting so rapidly that it left everyone reeling. Marcus stared at the video, his breath shallow, his mind struggling to accept that freedom might still be possible. The judge's face darkened, not with the impartiality of justice, but with the realization that a grave mistake had been made, or worse, an injustice had been knowingly pursued. The prosecutor, once so composed and superior, now sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing helplessly, the smooth rhythm of his practiced lies shattered by the raw, unfiltered truth displayed on the screen. Marcus's lawyer acted quickly, snatching the phone from the boy's trembling hands, holding it high for the judge and jury to see. His voice, usually steady and methodical, now trembled with a mix of fury and relief. He declared the video as evidence, irrefutable, undeniable, the key to Marcus's freedom. The judge's gavel slammed down with force, a desperate attempt to regain control over the pandemonium. In that moment, the foundation of the prosecution's case collapsed, the walls they had built around Marcus crumbling into dust. The boy had spoken the truth, and the system had no choice but to listen. The judge did not hesitate. His gavel slammed against the wood, sending a sharp crack through the air, but the courtroom was already in chaos. The murmurs had swelled into full-fledged conversation, voices rising in disbelief, in anger, in realization. The bailiff moved forward, his polished shoes tapping against the cold floor as he approached the boy. He extended a hand, waiting as the boy hesitated for only a moment before placing his battered phone into his gloved palm. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the edges of his papers, his jaw locked so tightly it looked as if his teeth might crack under the pressure. The judge, usually indifferent, now leaned forward, his attention fully on the device in the bailiff's hands. His fingers tapped against the desk, an unspoken demand for urgency. Within minutes, the video that had upended the entire trial was being transferred to the courtroom's large screen. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered, the grainy footage coming to life in front of them all. Marcus held his breath. He had spent months listening to the prosecution twist reality, watching his own name be stained with crimes he had never committed. He had been powerless as the system steamrolled over his truth, as every argument his lawyer made had been brushed aside with cold efficiency. But now, with the press of a button, the truth was no longer something that could be debated. It was right there, on display for all to see. The real thief, a man whose features were clear, undeniable in focus, strode out of the corner store. The timestamp on the footage matched the exact time of the robbery. He was wearing the same jacket the prosecutor had insisted belonged to Marcus. He was carrying the stolen items that Marcus had supposedly taken. A chill rippled through the room. The weight of the evidence crashed down on the courtroom like a hammer to glass. Marcus watched the prosecutor's face crumble. The confidence that had dripped from his every word, the smug ease with which he had painted Marcus as a criminal, it all vanished. His hands twitched, his lips parted slightly as if searching for an argument, but there was none to be made. The judge's gaze darkened. For weeks, he had sat in his seat, acting as though Marcus's fate was already decided, as though this trial was just another step in a long and predictable process. But now, his expression was unreadable, his demeanor shifting from detached authority to something sharper, something colder. His voice cut through the tension, sharper than it had been in the entire trial. He ordered an immediate review of the evidence, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus's lawyer stood, his body tense with a mixture of fury and triumph. He had fought for months, had pushed against the weight of a system designed to ignore men like Marcus, and now, at last, the walls were crumbling. The jury, who had spent most of the trial avoiding Marcus's gaze, now stared straight at him. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked guilty. None of them could ignore what was in front of them anymore. The case was falling apart in real time. The prosecutor tried to regain his composure, but his hands betrayed him, shaking slightly as he reached for his briefcase. He shuffled through his papers as if a counter-argument might magically appear, but there was nothing left to twist, nothing left to manipulate. Marcus felt something shift inside him. For the first time in months, something foreign settled in his chest, something he had not dared to feel since the moment he had been arrested. Hope. It was fragile, hesitant, but it was there. The system had done everything in its power to erase his voice, but the truth had been louder. The truth had broken through. The courtroom was no longer a place of silent judgment. It had become something else, a battlefield, where the lies that had bound Marcus for so long were finally being cut away. And he knew, in that moment, that everything was about to change. Marcus stood outside the courthouse steps, feeling the weight of the past months, years, a lifetime finally begin to lift off his shoulders. The cold air wrapped around him, biting at his skin, but he welcomed it. It was the first breath of freedom he had tasted in too long. For months, he had thought about this moment, imagined it, wished for it. But now that it was real, now that he was standing here, not in a cage, not in shackles, not in a courtroom where his life was nothing more than a legal debate, he didn't know what to do with himself. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, staring at the open world in front of him. People passed by, their conversations blending into the background, their lives untouched by what had just happened inside those courtroom walls. The weight of everything that could have been, everything that had almost happened, pressed against him, but the reality of what was now possible pushed back harder. Beside him, the boy stood quietly, his small frame seemingly bigger now in the glow of the courthouse lights. He had run into that courtroom as just a kid with a truth to tell, but standing here now, he looked like something more, someone who had done what grown men in suits had failed to do. Marcus turned to him, his throat tight with everything he wanted to say but couldn't find the words for. Thank you wasn't enough. Nothing he could say would ever be enough. The boy met his gaze for a moment, then shrugged and shoved his hands into his pockets, his breath visible in the cold night air. He didn't look for praise. He didn't ask for anything in return. He had changed a man's life, and yet, he stood there as if he had just done what anyone else would have done in his place. Marcus knew that wasn't true. People had watched him fight for his life for months and had done nothing. The system had tried to swallow him whole, and no one had spoken up. No one except this boy. Marcus felt the emotion thick in his throat, pressing against his chest, but he held it back. The weight of this moment was too big, too powerful, and if he let himself feel all of it at once, he might not be able to stand. The boy shifted his feet against the pavement, his breath still coming fast, as if he hadn't fully come down from the weight of what he had done. Marcus had spent months thinking about what freedom would feel like, whether it would feel like relief or exhaustion or something in between. But as he stood there, he realized it felt like something else entirely. It felt like truth, not luck, not mercy, truth. It had taken one voice, one act of courage, one moment of defiance to break through the walls that had been built around his fate. Because this boy had spoken when no one else would, Marcus was free.